Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 134, and I am the show's host, Kyle. Joining me on today's show, again, Will Porter. For those of you who don't know Will, who is a frequent guest of the show, he is a foreign policy expert and studies a lot on Mideast affairs. His work can be found at Consortium News, antiwar.com, libertarianinstitute.org, and the Daily Sheeple. Will, how are you doing today?
Hey, Kyle, I'm good, man. Thanks for having me on again. How are you?
I'm doing well. And I got Will on today's show to talk about a couple of pieces. The main thing we're going to focus on is Ukraine's NATO bid, but we also have an update from Will's previous appearance on the show as well. For those of you who like to share the show, and me and Will both appreciate it, get our names out there, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. You can find all my work, and most of Will's work ends up there too. So if you're looking for stuff by me and Will Porter, libertarianinstitute.org is a great place to start. Okay, Will, so you got this one published at consortiumnews.com. Congratulations on that. And it's titled, Ukraine's NATO Bid Risks Even Worse U.S.-Russia Ties. So, Will, I guess, there's a lot to cover here to make this whole thing make sense. And if we really, want to go back a few years, what was, I guess, the U.S. relationship like with Ukraine and just Ukraine's overall status, fall of the Soviet Union and in the years after that?
Yeah, sure. So, there is a large span, like a swath of history to cover here to sort of give context. So just first, I'll just briefly say that, in the waning days of the Soviet Union, the United States had promised the Russians that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, would not expand eastward. But since that time, we've sort of expanded it eastward and included 13 more countries in that alliance. And so that's all happening in this context of these assurances given to the then crumbling USSR.
These assurances were given in order, I guess, to make the dismemberment of the USSR peaceful and, I guess, to just make the whole process follow more smoothly. I mean, the United States was getting something in return for making these concessions, correct?
Yes. It was all about making the sort of like de-Sovietization, however you would like to say that, the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, about making that smoother and sort of like not provoking a lot of unrest and stuff in these other countries with our presence, and not giving the appearance of a massive Western victory of like we're just taking over. But nonetheless, these assurances were given to the Russians in the waning days of the USSR there.
All right, great. I just wanted to kind of point out that this wasn't a something that one guy said one time, in the news media. This was like an actual, agreement, maybe not like a signed treaty that the U.S. made with Russia, but was an agreement between U.S. and Russian leadership. Yeah, Soviet absolutely. Leadership at the time, I suppose.
Right, absolutely. It was not just it wasn't one diplomat saying this. You can go and look at, I think it's the George Washington University. It's either that or George Mason. I don't know why I'm blanking on that right now. But the university with the National Security Archive that published these declassified documents, it shows several meetings with several high-level U.S. officials, including, I think, the Secretary of State, who his word was not 1 inch, that NATO would not expand 1 inch. I think that was Burns. This is not just a one-off thing. This was several high-up American officials. This is their line, and so that was just sort of the context I wanted to lay out of the U.S. and Russian relations in the context of NATO. Now Ukraine specifically, their sort of relationship with the United States and with NATO, it kind of began in 2008. That was when they initially signaled their desires to join the alliance. And by 2008, several other Eastern European countries and Russian neighbors had joined. I give the list of the full 13 countries in my piece, so your listeners can go check that out. But in 2008, they initially signaled their desire to join, but nothing had really happened there. The U.S., I think, kind of gave some kind of nod to that. But it wasn't until 2014, the year of the Ukrainian coup, actually, that they sort of started moving forward with this and taking additional steps to, pursue NATO membership.
All right, well, so let's, pick it up right there again. And, what happened in 2014? Because the Olympic Games are going on at that time. And, Obama, coming into office, had talked about having a Russian reset. So how do we get from there to, civil war in Ukraine? Can you take us through that process?
Yeah, exactly. So I alluded to the coup already in 2014. Now, this was the second uprising in Ukraine, actually. back in 2004, about 10 years prior, there was a thing called the Orange Revolution, where basically a segment of the Ukrainian society took to the streets to challenge an election result. The sort of Western-favored candidate in that election was a guy named Viktor Yushchenko, and the more Russian-backed, or at least the Russian-speaking people in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass, they favored a guy named Viktor Yanukovych, who he'll play a role in the 2014 coup. And basically, Yanukovych won the election, and it was challenged, and on the recount or the revote, Yushchenko won. And so I don't know all the details of how the United States supported this, but they definitely supported it rhetorically. But I suspect they did more, materially, to support this sort of Ukrainian uprising to overturn this election. Now, jumping ahead just a few years later, in 2010, Viktor Yanukovych would get elected, so Ukrainians would put this guy back in power. And so it's not so clear that the original election back in 2004, it's not so clear that was illegitimate, even though that was what was claimed. Either that or both elections were illegitimate. But nonetheless, this guy ended up back in power, and the U.S. doesn't really like this guy. So he's back in office, and in 2014, this issue arises over a deal to associate more with the European Union. It was like an association deal. And Viktor Yanukovych decided not to go through with that deal. And this is what triggered what was called the Euromaidan protest movement. And this is really where the coup gets started and where the U.S. role sort of intensifies. Now, the U.S. did several things in this coup to sort of intervene and to take the side of the protesters or the Euromaidan people. And so there was a leaked phone call recording between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt. And Victoria Nuland was a State Department apparatchik. I forget her exact title. It's in the piece. And with the Ukrainian ambassador, Jeffrey Pyatt, and they're basically picking members of Ukraine's transitional government before the coup takes place. And so obviously this is a pretty strong involvement if we're picking members, and it came true too. The people who are selected in that leaked recording, those are the people who end up in the Ukrainian government. One guy in particular, Yats is the guy, Nuland says. And that recording was leaked and publicized, but it was a big scandal because Victoria Nuland said, F the EU. And that was sort of the big scandal over it, not the fact that the United States, people in our administration, the Obama administration, I should say, were picking, hand-selecting members of Ukraine's government after their coup. And so that was one sort of very insightful episode of just how involved our government was in that coup d'etat. And now a sort of second element to all of this was an organization called the National Endowment for Democracy. And this group claims to be a private, non-governmental organization, an NGO. But it's pretty clear that they're not. If you go and look at the National Endowment for Democracy's records, they get all of their money, virtually all of their money, from the U.S. State Department. And so this really should be more seen as a wing of the U.S. government carrying out American policies. And the National Endowment for Democracy spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in Ukraine setting up media and activist groups. And in their largest project, where they gave $500,000 to one group, they gave it to a group called the International Republican Institute. And this is a group that's chaired by Senator John McCain, and they have close ties to the NED. And back in 2004, this group was caught training members of the Haitian coup that the Bush administration sort of rubber stamped. And so it's kind of interesting how these agencies keep popping up in these countries every time there's a coup or a regime change somewhere.
And it seems significant that John McCain, would be the head of that NGO, because I don't know if you get to this in the article, I don't quite remember, but at one point, him and Lindsey Graham, I forget, was it this New Year's or the New Year's past, he was talking to Ukrainian soldiers, pumping them up, to go out and have a year of aggression and basically to win a civil war that was currently in a ceasefire, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah,
he is in no means a unbiased actor in this Ukrainian situation. He definitely has a side.
Right, and he nonetheless presides over, it is called the International Republican Institute, but just sort of like the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, I don't think that necessarily has anything to do with the party. I think it's supposed to be sort of like a neutral NGO that kind of just goes and helps to strengthen institutions and do things like that. Not necessarily be have a very biased and unneutral take. And now another thing that should be mentioned about the Ukrainian coup, and it's not exactly clear if there are ties between the NED or the International Republican Institute and these other groups. However, the sort of vanguard of the Ukrainian protest movement and the street protests were literal neo-Nazis. And when I say neo-Nazis, I don't just mean vaguely right-leaning alt-right guys or Trump people or something. No, I mean actual neo-Nazis, people who worship and celebrate a guy named Stepan Bandera, who was a World War II Nazi collaborator in Ukraine and an outright, pretty closely shared this kind of radical nationalist ideology with the Nazis. And so these are the type of people who we were sponsoring in this coup, whether it was directly through the NED or whether it was just indirectly in the sense that we were backing their side. But these are basically, people we put into power. For example, Andrew Paraby, who is the leader of I believe the Social National Party, which sounds familiar to me, Social Nationalist Party. But this guy ended up in a high up position in Ukraine's basically their DOD, their Defense Department. This neo-Nazi guy. So these guys weren't just sort of cosmetic or it only appeared that they were part of this. They were deeply part of this coup.
And I know this sounds very conspiratorial to the listeners who don't haven't heard this story before. Maybe read some of the articles that myself and Will have. But, just to maybe validate it to some of the more mainstream listeners, it went as far as I believe in this past year's NDAA. They actually put in a provision saying that U.S. weapons cannot go to groups that are neo-Nazis, and it was definitely directed at this situation in Ukraine. So
right, exactly.
They're even taking legislative action on it, guys. So this is a real thing going on. I just wanted to make that clear.
Right. No, seriously. Go look up the Svoboda Party, Svoboda. It's a Ukrainian party. Go look up the Social National Party. Go look up the Azov Battalion. These guys are more or less neo-Nazis. I mean, they do Nazi salutes. They fly Nazi flags and use Nazi insignia. I'm not exaggerating here. I know the word Nazi gets thrown around a lot, but no, literal Nazis were spearheading this protest movement.
It's a situation somewhat like Syria, right, where we've gone over before how the United States, even if they were actually giving weapons to people that hadn't pledged loyalty to Osama bin Laden, the fact is that that's where the weapons ended up getting. And that's who benefited on the battlefield. And that's the same situation we have in Ukraine, right?
Absolutely, exactly. You shouldn't whitewash, even if we're not directly giving weapons or giving money, which isn't so clear to me that we weren't. But even if we weren't giving money or weapons to these type of extremist groups, the fact that we're taking their side effectively is helping them. And so you can't really ignore that.
So, another part of this 2004 coup and the ensuing civil war that happens is what happens on the Crimean Peninsula. And that changes from being Ukrainian territory to being Russian territory. So do you want to explain how that happened, Will?
Yeah, exactly. So soon after the coup, a few former Ukrainian presidents actually put forward the suggestion that the new Ukrainian government should sort of revoke the lease that Russia had to the Sevastopol naval base in Crimea, in the Crimean Peninsula. And basically, the Russians have had their Black Sea Fleet stationed at this naval base since the 1700s, since the time around the signing of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And it's a long-term, important asset to the Russians. It's one of their only warm water ports in this region of the world. And so Russia decided they were absolutely not allowing this to happen, that this little coup d'etat to take away their long-standing, centuries-long naval base. Because it should also be known that Crimea was a part of Russia, and Russia only gave it over to the Ukrainians in some arbitrary political decision of the Soviet Union. But generally, it has sort of a population that identifies as Russian, and some speak Russian. And
and I guess just real quickly to draw an equivalent maybe to what happened with the situation in Ukraine under the USSR. I mean, all the states were just one thing. They would be like American states. And so if for whatever reason you look at a map of Illinois and they lopped off and gave the southern half of Illinois to Missouri, and then one day, the United States broke up and that southern half of Illinois then wanted to be a part of the rest of Illinois again, well, it becomes much more significant and important, right?
Right, exactly. If you understand that the people who live here sort of identify as a member of this other country, then yeah, it's, I don't know, that's important to understanding this whole thing.
Yeah, I believe a majority of people there spoke Russian.
Yeah, I believe so too. And it should just be noted that Ukraine itself has sort of this general ethnic and linguistic breakdown that in the east, in the region known as the Donbass, it's mostly Russophonic people who speak Russian and people who sort of identify ethnically and nationally as Russian. And so that's also important later into understanding the sort of the fighting that broke out after the coup. But
and I think some of this was even done intentionally by Soviet leadership to put Russian people within other areas of the Soviet Union, I guess, and order
no
to
doubt.
spread influence or create what they thought would be stability. I'm not saying it was a good program or it worked. I'm just saying they did it.
Right, no doubt, and I think it was also to sort of like help to sort of like get around sort of a national identity forming in some of these places that would be the backbone of an anti-communist movement. You know, mixing Russians in there and like Russifying the place. Like I don't know, I can see the interests of the USSR doing that based on their sort of imperial interests. But just getting back to Crimea, so in response to sort of this, the Ukrainian government didn't actually pass this through law. It was just a suggestion, but that was enough for the Russians to say, okay, screw that. We're like going to ensure that we keep this port here. And so they annexed the Crimean Peninsula back to Russia. And by annex, they didn't march in columns of tanks and fly airstrikes and have to, impose a no-fly zone or anything. The Russians that were stationed already in Crimea basically just left their bases, and it was largely a bloodless event. And what's more, actually, Pew and Gallup have gone back to poll Crimeans and asked them what they think about this, and a super majority of Crimeans agree that with Russia's move there. And so this move has been called Russian aggression over and over again in Western media, but if that's the extent of Russian aggression, is that kind of like bloodless coup, I don't know. It was really kind of lackluster for a terrible aggressive maneuver, you know?
Right, and I think the people even had a referendum for whatever it's worth supporting this move. So, I mean, and I know people like raise questions with the referendums. I get that, only 40-something% of Americans went out voting, yet we're stuck with Donald Trump as president when about a quarter of the people voted for him. So I get how the referendums could be messy or whatever. But in this case, this happened, and there's not massive protest or uprising right now begging to be a part of Ukraine once again.
No, and Western polling firms went to Crimea and asked these people, and a huge percentage of them, like, it pretty much seems to validate. Because, I wouldn't trust a Russians overseeing this referendum or whatever, but I much more would trust Western polling firms confirming that, corroborating each other's findings, basically. Like, that to me kind of solidifies that it seems like that's what they wanted there.
Right. And so we have the civil war in Ukraine. I think 10,000 civilians or more at this point have been counted dead. Generally, it seems now to be at somewhat of a stalemate. There's the Minsk 2 ceasefire that's in place. There's violations of it, but they don't seem to be serious enough to have it fall apart. I mean, do you have anything else to add in during this time, Will?
Yeah, I guess I could just kind of briefly explain that whole thing. So, soon after the Euromaidan protest movement was successful and sort of ousted Viktor Yanukovych from government, a movement in this eastern region that I've referred to as the Donbass, where there's a lot of Russian-speaking people, a sort of separatist movement erupted out there, where they kind of wanted to form their own autonomous region, and basically citing the Euromaidan protests, like, hey, you guys just kind of had your thing, and now we're having our thing. We want to do it exactly what you just did. And the new government in Kiev that was just talking about celebrating democracy and political autonomy, like, said hell no, and they sent the military clear across the country to fight these eastern separatists. And again, spearheading those military units are a lot of these neo-Nazi militias. And in fact, it's in that context that the U.S. passed that law that said you can't arm the Azov battalion in their war against these Donbass separatists. And so, this coup that we've supported in Ukraine has destabilized the country in this way by, splitting it along this sort of linguistic and ethnic line.
Right. And under Obama, the United States did provide what they called non-lethal aid, correct? And then Trump removed that barrier and allowed the U.S. to provide lethal aid, right?
Yeah, exactly. I believe what we give them are Javelin missiles now. We sell that. Sell that to the Ukrainian military.
I guess now, can we look at where Ukraine is on the path to NATO membership? I mean, what's the process? How close are they?
Yeah. So I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here and speak of this as a foregone conclusion or it's a certainty. It's not exactly clear that this is going to happen. However, just recently, within I think it was late February or early March, President Poroshenko of Ukraine basically submitted what's called a membership action plan to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. And this basically involves negotiations between the prospective member state of Ukraine and NATO, and Ukraine will be asked to sort of make various adjustments according to NATO's sort of requirements. And so Ukraine will have to spend a certain percentage of their GDP on military spending, which I believe they already actually surpassed the right number, and so they might not have to change that. But there's various requirements, and so that's the stage that that Ukraine's in now with their negotiations to become a member.
And the Senate would have to have a vote. I remember when there was one on Montenegro Montenegro. And of course, it was that Rand Paul, Bernie Sanders that said no to it, and everybody else voted yes. But, I think that was actually the vote where John McCain on the floor of the Senate called Rand Paul a Russian puppet or something, a stooge of Vladimir Putin. Exactly. Something similar to that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you want to talk about that just for a second? Well, what the actual mainstream narrative has been here? And, you don't have to refute it all, but just explain what you would hear from the average politician, left, right, what you'll hear on MSNBC or Fox News.
Right, totally. So the whole narrative about Ukraine specifically, but I think it's sort of said about any of these like Eastern European countries, which, mind you, all recent NATO members are in Eastern Europe, the Russian neighbors. But sort of the narrative is like, the people of Ukraine want to join the West. They want to join the EU and the European community and join modernity, basically, and leave this like mean old Russian, the old sphere of this old world. But the Russians are holding them back with all these threats and keeping them in their place. And so basically the idea is that the U.S. has to help these countries liberate themselves from the mean old Russians. And that's sort of how the whole Ukrainian thing has been framed. As I mentioned, the whole thing started in relation to this. I don't think it was specifically a trade deal. It was called an association agreement with the European Union that Yanukovych decided not to do. Or Yanukovych, excuse me, decided not to do. And so this was all framed and like, oh, look, Russia has, pressured him into not making a deal with the EU. And so that's sort of the whole framing.
And so not guaranteed that Ukraine's going to end up joining NATO, but it does seem that there's a consensus in the United States that would be the right move, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, so people would say that, yeah, we have to help, bring in Ukraine into NATO and help to shield them from the Russian adversary.
Okay. So now, Will, I guess where we're at, Russia's going to oppose this move. Why is Russia going to do that?
All right, well, yeah, so Ukraine, I think, is important to Russia for a number of reasons. It's not sort of no longer an outstanding issue, but the Crimea thing was, a big issue. That was like sort of when you go and look at leaked State Department cables, it really details this discussion. There's one that was entitled "Niet means Niet" from 2008 that really lays out Russia's like anxieties about Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. And sort of the Russian-speaking people in the East were one of the concerns, and I think the Crimea thing was also one of the issues. Okay, but now the Crimea thing's sort of off the table because they've annexed it. But I sort of think the outstanding issue would be that Russia does not want the United States, the West, to have a new battleground, basically, a new place to station missile systems, as we've been doing in other Russian neighbors, or a new place to host military exercises or training right outside of Russia's borders in a very provocative way. And so I think that basic aversion to that, it's pretty easy to understand, especially when you see the 13 other countries around Russia's borders that have been brought into NATO and the things that we've been doing there with sort of, either selling or deploying missile systems there like Patriot batteries or conducting training exercises, like I said. I've written on these things quite a bit. I think I linked out to this stuff in the consortium piece, so you can check that out.
Right, and as you were saying, there's Poland, now a NATO country, a NATO expansion country. I believe they came in under Clinton. There's Patriot missile batteries there. If you look at Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, there's, either U.S. troops deployed to those areas or there's U.S. equipment in those areas, and various NATO countries like the U.K. Or Germany will send troops to these areas as well. We've deployed troops in Poland that are within a few hundred miles or even less so of the Russian border. Finland, once again, up north there, we have, I believe, a couple hundred Marines stationed near the Russian border. And so we've really, have Russia pretty much surrounded, as far as almost all the old Soviet states are now within NATO, minus Ukraine, Georgia, and maybe 2 or 3 others.
Right, exactly. And Georgia is on, next to Ukraine, Georgia is on the list as an aspirant nation to become a NATO member. And so we're also eyeing Georgia.
And me and Will have mentioned Georgia once in the past on the show before. I believe when we were talking about some of the regime change operations that led to Omar the Chechen being an ISIS field commander, we had slightly gotten into that. And I'll go and link to, I believe that was the Rise of ISIS episode 113. So, Will, do you have anything else to add on this? Anything else in your article that I missed, or anything else important to stay here?
I think we covered all the important stuff. I'd, of course, encourage your listeners to go read the piece. There's maybe, there's some details that we didn't get into.
It's linked to the show notes page, so it'll be real easy for everybody to find. just go foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. And of course, the show notes pages are too at libertarianinstitute.org.
All right, excellent. But yeah, just sort of in closing, in summary, I just wanted to say, yeah, I basically wrote this piece because I don't think, like I said, it's not a foregone conclusion that Ukraine will become a NATO member, but sort of as it's sort of trying to become one and aspiring to become one on its path to membership, somebody should be talking about what we're risking here, what sort of strategic and, what sort of implications or impacts this going to have on U.S. international relations, particularly with Russia, the other country with a massive hydrogen bomb arsenal. So I think that's significant. We should look and see what sort of the factors are, as part of this. What will this entail?
And even if it doesn't get all the way to the H-bomb issue, if you just look at the United States and Russia are going to have to negotiate in Syria at some point, you would imagine. Similarly, Russia shares a border with North Korea. And so, and Russia is also a player in the Iran nuclear agreement and somewhat of an ally with Iran. And so if you look at all these places where the U.S. is looking to negotiate, from at least the Russian side, I'm sure the Ukraine situation will play a little bit of a factor in there.
Right, no doubt. And yeah, when I mentioned the hydrogen bombs, I don't mean to be alarmist like we're, on the brink of nuclear war. I just mean this is ultimately what we're risking. These are ultimately the stakes that we're playing with here, and we should never lose sight of that.
Absolutely. So the last thing I want to talk to Will about today is actually kind of a follow-up from Foreign Policy Focus 181, which was Will's last appearance on the show. And actually, I just wanted to point out the YouTube channel Immersion News, which is my YouTube channel. I actually have a separate playlist for all of Will's interviews for anybody who wants to check that out. But this article ran at libertarianinstitute.org and it's titled Chemical Facility Hit in Syria Strike Cleared by Inspectors in 2017. Oh, twice by inspectors in 2017. And so, Will, can you just give kind of a short summary of what you uncovered in the OPCW archives? If you guys really want the whole story here, you'll have to go back to the last show, so this isn't another hour and a half long episode.
Right, yeah. I'll try to summarize this as briefly as I can. So, yeah, the April 14th strikes by the U.S., the U.K., and France hit at least what we know for sure 2 complexes said to be involved in Syria's chemical weapons program. One that was called Barza in Metro Damascus, and another one that was called, or 2 buildings that were associated with a complex called Him Shinshar that were west of Homs City in Syria. And these strikes were in retaliation to an alleged chemical weapons attack by the regime, the Syrian regime. Unproven allegations. And now, in official documents of the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, I found that one of the facilities hit in the April 14th strike, the Barza facility, had actually been inspected twice by the OPCW and cleared in 2017, and sort of declared clean, that it was not involved in any illicit chemical weapons work. And that is way at odds with administration official, U.S. official claims about this facility, which was, as I've said this before, but described as being at the heart of Syria's chemical weapons program. And so what I found in these official documents seems to contradict that. And now I contacted the OPCW to sort of to clarify some of these discrepancies that I found. And they refused to comment or to kind of clarify the discrepancy between administration claims that this was some kind of evil, facility still involved in chemical weapons manufacture and the OPCW's conclusion. And so that sort of still, like I said, I would come back and brief your audience about what I found and what the OPCW told me. Well, that's what they told me. They refused to answer my question effectively. Now, the second point here is that in OPCW documents, I found out that 25 of Syria's original 27 chemical weapons facilities had been destroyed, and that these remaining 2 facilities were slated to be destroyed. And so, it appeared that the Syrian government was cooperating in the destruction of their whole chemical weapons program. In 2013, I believe, or 2014, there was a deal struck that was brokered by Russia where Syria agreed to give up all of its chemical weapons, and they did so in 2014, and that was all confirmed. And since then, they've been slowly, one by one, destroying each of these 27 chemical weapons facilities, and there are 2 remaining today. And so I wanted the OPCW to tell me what the names of these 2 facilities were, because I was interested to know if either of those 2, which had prior not been named in any reports, I wanted to know if either of those 2 had been bombed on the April 14th strike. Because to me it would have been interesting if the American or French or British government bombed a facility that the Syrians were planning to demolish.
Well, it would have been critical, because if anything, that just saves, I mean, I'm being a little, I guess, exaggerating here, but it just saves us a lot of money if that's what we're doing. If we're bombing facilities, this is going to destroy anyway. And it also goes against the narrative that he was using these facilities to make chemical weapons if they're in the process of destroying them.
Right, exactly. And so, yeah, I was trying to confirm whether Himshinshar, either of the buildings bombed in Himshinshar or Barza, corresponded to these two facilities that they refer to, but don't name in the reports. And the OPCW, again, refused to do that. So this is sort of still a mystery. Now, based on some of the wording, I doubt that Barza was one of these two facilities. However, Himshinshar could easily have been one of them that were slated for demolition, and we just don't know. And so it's unfortunate, it's sort of still inconclusive, but nonetheless, we have found that one of the facilities bombed on April 14th was cleared by inspectors twice last year, the most recent time in November. And the second thing that we know from these documents is that the only two remaining chemical weapons facilities left in Syria, according to the OPCW, are slated to be destroyed. And so I think both of these things raise a lot of questions.
All right, well, thank you so much for the update. I mean, as I was saying, that's really important stuff because if this is the attack that the United States is carrying out, and the White House is saying that there's an imminent danger to the United States, and it turns out that these are buildings slated to be destroyed anyway, then that claim's absolutely insane.
Right, exactly. Or destroyed or cleared by inspectors. In either case, I think it's still, inconsistent.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Will, so I guess that's where we're going to wrap up the show for today. Thank you so much again for coming on. As I said in the beginning, Will's a freelance journalist. Work can be found at consortiumnews.com. The Daily Sheeple, there's a huge archive of Will's work there. libertarianinstitute.org, antiwar.com. And Will, do you want to plug your Twitter handle and anything else you got going on?
Yeah, sure. You can find me on Twitter at WKPANCAP, ANCAP. And if you really like my work, you can contribute at patreon.com/WKPjournalist.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. You can find this show at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Play, Spotify, libertarianinstitute.org, as I was saying before. Facebook is Libertarian Union, at KYAAALE on Twitter, and then mine's YouTube and BitChute, it's Immersion News, and the new website is Immersion News. So that's everything I got going on. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kyle.